Okay, in this lecture, I will finish up with Confucius. We'll talk a little bit more about the Junzi, some other passages from books 1 and 2 that tell us about what the Junzi is like, and I will look at a few passages about knowledge, and then briefly compare Confucius with the teachings of Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism. In passage 114, the master says, a Junzi, the master, by the way, is always Confucius. So the master says, a Junzi is not concerned that food fill his belly. He does not seek comfort in his residence. So a person who meets this highest ideal is not concerned about filling their belly with food nor comfort in where they live. So they're not concerned with these kinds of material comforts. Going on, if a person is apt in conduct and cautious in speech, stays near to those who keep to the Tao, that is the good way and the natural way, and corrects himself thereby, he may be said to love learning. And notice that the most plausible way of understanding why these two claims fit together in the same passage, why they're part of the same section or written on the same strip of bamboo, is that loving learning for Confucius is a major feature of the Junzi. And so these other good qualities are such that having these good qualities goes together with being someone who may be said to love learning in this way that Confucius values. At the opening of Book 2, we get a mention of a new concept that's important for us, which is virtue. The Chinese word for this is dai, and it means something like the good way of doing things. So it's actually very similar to Tao when interpreted in that good way sense. But whereas Tao has this implication of a way that pre-exists what any of us do and is kind of out there and we enter into and participate in, virtue dai, that is, has the sense of something that characterizes our practices or our behaviors. So it's a kind of moral standard, or it's a kind of, another way of translating it would be righteousness or rectitude, behaving in the right way. And in this passage, Confucius makes an astronomical comparison, which is interesting. He says that ruling by virtue is like the North Star, in the sense that the virtue or the ruling by virtue serves as a kind of stable object, and everything else moves around it. So the recommendation here is something like you should rule in such a way that you are following this moral standard, and then everything else, the citizens and the decisions about different features of the society and other structures in society will fall into place in the right way. Ruling by means of virtue is means that one has a consistent, solid standard that one is following, and one can trust that everything else will pay reverence to that one standard. Just like the North Star, because it's the pole star, it is always in roughly the same position when you look up into the sky, because the Earth is moving on its axis, but the star is always more or less directly north of the, directly above the poles. So when you look up, it's in the same place in the sky, and all of the other constellations move around it as the days and months and years change. And in the same way, virtue is something that we can rely on as a kind of stable standard, something by which we can get our bearings always, and we can trust that other things will fall into place around. In these passages from Book 2, we have some more information about the Junzi. So I had already described to you this claim that the Junzi is not a vessel and said a little bit about what that means. But here are some other descriptors. So the Junzi the master says, is one who first tries out a precept and only after follows it. The idea there is the Junzi doesn't just do what anybody tells them to do or what anybody suggests. They are reflective in what they do. If they hear an idea, they think, I should, that sounds like that might work, and they try it out cautiously to see how well it works before they go on to adopt it. So it's almost a little kind of experimental method here, probably in context of leadership or in context of governance, but or maybe in personal behavior as well. But I think what's important is the reflective quality, that the Junzi, again, is not just a vessel. They're not just a tool that like you tell to do something and they do it. They reflect on the information coming in, and they think carefully and they choose carefully about what it is that they'll do. And they do things like try something out in small amounts so that there isn't a catastrophic consequence if it doesn't work. But then if it does work, then they go on to employ it more generally. And then finally, in the passage that immediately follows that one, Confucius says the Junzi is inclusive and not a partisan. The small man, the word for that is xiaoren, which literally means small person or small human, is a partisan and not inclusive. So the idea here is that the Junzi has a broad perspective on things. The Junzi is able to see the pros and cons of lots of different positions. The Junzi has a balanced view of things. The Junzi wants everybody to get along, doesn't want to set people in opposition to one another. Okay, that's part of what being inclusive means, right? Whereas the small man, which is kind of Confucius's opposite, his word for the opposite of the Junzi. This is a person who is kind of petty. They're not focused on the things that really matter. They get caught up in their own resentments, or they get caught up in their own limited point of view, rather than really seeing things for what they are, or seeing things in terms of the broader set of things at stake, the goods and bads at stake in a situation, and behaving in a balanced and reasonable and a good way. Okay, and so the Xiaoren, as Confucius says it here, is partisan and not inclusive. So they take a position against others, and they fight against others, and they treat the situation as one where one side is right and the other side is wrong. And Confucius is saying that's not the good way to be. A better way to be is to be inclusive and not partisan. It's not that Confucius is saying just agree, that the Junzi should just agree with everybody, but it's that the Junzi should try to see things from a broad enough point of view that they're not just taking a kind of biased position on something. And finally, we have these three passages about knowledge and about studying. And even though they are a little bit out of the framework of a course on ethics, they're more a part of the philosophical subfield the subfield of philosophy known as epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. You could also say like theories of scientific method, or theories of how to learn about things. These expressions are so interesting that I couldn't give up the chance to talk about them with you briefly. So if you look at 2:15, this is a passage I often think of as a researcher. And if you all ever do research and in your studies just as students, this is a nice thing to kind of bear in mind. Confucius says, if you study but don't reflect, you'll be lost. So you just kind of have your head down in the books and you're just taking in information all the time, but never taking a moment to think about it and what it means and how it fits together. And on the other hand, if you reflect but don't study, you'll get into trouble. So what he has in mind there is people who don't study things but just spin out theories out of their own heads, or just try to kind of reason about how things must be, but they don't go out and gather information about whatever might be relevant to figuring out how things are. And so he's advocating for a kind of balance, a kind of inclusion in one's study practices of both studying, gathering information, but also reflecting on that information. 216 is a bit hard to interpret, but the commentator in the text that we have read for this week makes a nice suggestion here. Since this fragment or this passage appears in between two other passages about knowledge, it might be that Confucius was talking about knowledge here. So the passage reads, one who sets to work on a different strand does damage. And you can think here of a kind of person working on weaving something along with others, right? So they're kind of taking the strands and they're weaving them together to make a big cloth blanket, let's say, okay? And if somebody takes a strand that's different from what others are working on, or maybe a better metaphor here, or a better image is of working on ropes, okay? So you're kind of taking strands and weaving them together to make a longer strand, which is the rope. And one who sets to work on a different strand from what others are working on can actually make things worse, okay? So the idea here is it's a good idea to take up projects that other people are also working on. In other words, it's a bad idea to try to do all of your work, all of your figuring things out, all on your own, because others are already doing work and they already have projects underway. And by doing things in a very individual, idiosyncratic way on your own, you could actually make things worse in the world rather than better. It's better to, for instance, do a medical education and figure out what the medical community already understands about diseases, how they think about things, how they think about treatment and so on, than it is to try to invent your own medical science that overcomes all the problems of existing medical science. It's not to say that you couldn't find valuable innovations, major innovations in medical science, but it's that by doing things all on your own, you actually risk confusing things more, confusing the world and the way that things are going with medicine more than if you are to work on the same project that other people are working on. Then finally, we have an example of a conversation between Confucius and a student. The master says to Yu, who presumably asked him a question, "Shall I teach you about knowledge, Yu? To know when you know something, and to know when you don't. No, that's knowledge." Okay, so the implication here is that some people don't even know when they know and when they don't know, okay? Now think about this. A person who knows something but doesn't know that they know is a person who is underconfident in their knowledge, right? They're a person who is, when someone asks the question, what should we do? What should we do? They know the answer, this person, but they don't say it because they don't know that they know. And that's a problem. It's important to be confident in your knowledge if you actually do know something and to use it to advantage of everyone, okay? On the other hand, think about someone, this is probably the more common case, who thinks they know, but they don't actually know. Okay, so they don't know when they don't know. And that's very dangerous, right? And you think about people who are very confident in false ideas. They think they know, but they don't know. And that does a lot of damage. So even though this is somewhat paradoxical, since knowledge is being defined in terms of knowledge, it's being defined circularly, so to speak, I take it that those are the kinds of considerations that Confucius probably has in mind here. A final concept that's important in the Analects is what is referred to with the Chinese word li, which sometimes translated as rites, it's sometimes translated as rituals. These are the kind of almost religious rituals of the society, like the right sequence of actions to take to show mourning for one's parents after they pass away. okay, or the right sequence of steps to take on holidays, specific holidays that have a kind of celebratory function. And so these rituals, Confucius advocated following the rituals, and he advocated the importance of following the rituals and having reverence for the rituals as a matter of personal cultivation and as a matter of cultivation of Ren. Okay, so in order to become a junzi, in order to become someone who exhibits Ren, it's a good idea to practice and follow the rituals and show reverence for the rituals. He also criticized some people. He criticized a certain way of relating to the rituals, which was kind of trying to use them as instruments to get things from the divine. He thought that's not the right way to do it. It's not about doing the rituals so that the gods favor me and I get things that I want. It's rather about doing the ritual because the ritual is intrinsically good, and doing the ritual makes me a better person. And so it's an interesting kind of philosophy about religion in a way, and about the various rituals that we do in life. You know, why do we celebrate weddings or birthdays or religious holidays or other holidays in the ways that we do? Why don't we just say, oh, that's all a bunch of nonsense, I don't do that? There's a Confucian answer, which is because it makes us better people to do that. And that's part of how we kind of structure our own lives and our societies and our relation to one another. It's not that those things have some kind of it's not that those things were written into the structure of the universe by God and we always have to do this holiday at this time of year. They are conventional in a certain way, but they make us better people to do them. I think this is maybe not the only interpretation that you can give of Confucius on this point, but I think it's a plausible interpretation and it's one that I favor. Well, that wraps things up for Confucius's Analects. Hopefully that has been interesting and of some value to you to go through that text. I find it a fascinating and very illuminating and instructive text, the Analects, and it's easy to read. It's relatively short. So if you're interested, you can get a copy and read the whole thing. You could read the whole PDF that I posted on Canvas, for instance, if you're interested. I want to briefly mention this famous opposition that's sometimes presented between Confucius and Lao Tzu, who is the author of the book The Tao Te Ching, or you could translate it as the Virtue Way book, but usually when it's published in English, it's just published as the Tao Te Ching, either with D's or with T's in the title. With a lot of Chinese language stuff, the translation to the English, just the English letters, there are like, numbers, I don't know how many it is, but there are a number of different ways of kind of systems for translating Chinese characters into alphabetical characters, and so the same names and titles of books and so on will sometimes appear very differently in, for instance, a bookstore or on Amazon if you're buying books. But this character, Lao Tzu, started the tradition that's known as Taoism. And this tradition is very different from the Confucian in some ways. So both the Confucian and the Taoist tradition do value the Tao, the way of nature, the good way that things should go. But they differ slightly in that Lao Tzu thought that people could access that way, that the best way to access the way was not through cultivation in accordance with the rituals, and with the kind of established culture of a society, which is how Confucius thinks of it, but rather through a kind of return to a nature that pre-exists society. So for Lao Tzu, society is a kind of distorting and perverting and corrupting influence on our natural goodness. And so Lao Tzu emphasizes individual communion with nature itself, learning from nature itself, perhaps by living out in nature, not in cities, which are the kind of center of corruption and of culture, of civilization, yes, but also of a kind of distance from nature and from the way. Also, Lao Tzu emphasized the unreliability of social restrictions and norms, and some followers of Taoism have practiced magic and mysticism associated with it. So there was kind of an idea that one could, among some followers, not all, but that one could kind of harness the way in a way that would give one kind of like special powers. And so there's some interesting literature about that. So the way that the polarity between Confucianism and Taoism is usually presented is that Confucianism is about order and it's about respecting your elders, and it's about kind of cultivation within society, personal moral cultivation within society, whereas Taoism is about a kind of freedom from social constraints and a participation in the kind of extraordinary paradoxical powers of the way itself, which bursts out beyond the bounds of any particular social convention or set of norms in society. And it's an interesting opposition, and there are some great books written in both the Confucian tradition and the Taoist tradition in subsequent centuries that kind of help to further lay out that opposition between the two schools.